we want to move forward here to another very important issue, and that is the relationship of Israel and Latin America, which has been taking some hits as many Latin American nations have been fed up with what we've seen in terms of the genocide there in Gaza, especially Colombia, as you can see there at the bottom of the screen. So before I say too much, we'll just get right to the chase here. We are very happy to be joined to discuss all of this by Zoe Alexandra, who's a journalist and co-editor of People's Dispatch. Zoe, thank you so much for being with us.
Listen. Wow, we're back together again.
Yeah, we are back together again. Thanks so much for joining. Let's start here. I think there's a lot of things that can be said, but let's start here with Colombia, which, of course, the president there of Colombia has been making many statements against the genocide, but just took some important economic action as well vis-a-vis Colombia's trade with Israel. So if you could maybe enlighten us to what's taking place there.
Yeah, this past week, President Gustavo Petro announced a decree from the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Tourism saying that Colombia, due to, for example, the ruling of the ICJ, due to the warrants issued by the ICC and the different considerations by different UN bodies about Israel's actions in Gaza, the Republic of Colombia decided to suspend and ban coal exports to Israel. This is extremely significant as it's a very strong material deterrent to Israel. It's important to know that this is not, an easy decision for Colombia to make. Immediately after publishing this decree, he received all sorts of backlash, of course, from Israel. That's to be expected, but even internally from the Colombian Mining Association, which issued a very, very sharp kind of condemnation of what Petro did, and saying that, this is going to hurt actually the poor and oppressed communities in Colombia, and this goes against different agreements that Colombia has with Israel. Important to note that in 2014, Colombia signed a free trade agreement with Israel. This is, of course, under a right-wing government. The National Federation of Coal Producers also released a statement immediately saying that this would only hurt Colombia and the Colombian people, and this was a horrible decision. But again, this is coming off of 8 months of course, the genocide, and Gustavo Petro being one of the world leaders in condemning what's happening in Gaza, condemning the Israeli government, going so far as to compare, the Israeli government to Nazi Germany, all of these sorts of things, which has earned it a lot of, pushback from some of its key allies. But again, a truly historic move that I think in terms of other countries taking similar moves, I think we've only really seen such strong and concrete moves by Turkey.
So I want to, before we zoom out on the region, Zoe, I just want you to give a very brief background to why this is such a big deal specifically for Colombia. I mean, obviously Colombia has a new leader. I guess not too new anymore, but a newer leader who is progressive. But before this, Colombia was under basically right-wing dictatorship after right-wing dictatorship for quite some time, and even would brag about itself as being the Israel of Latin America, was essentially a proxy for the Americans. And it was one thing when Gustavo Petro was rhetorically going against Israel, calling this a genocide in the very beginning, back in October, November, December. But this is a very material stance to take that is going to impact both Israel and, like you mentioned, Colombia. So I just want you to give a little bit of a brief, background or to the significance of the fact that it is Colombia, of all countries, that is the one taking this step.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because of its historic position in relation to the U.S. and because Colombia, under kind of this, as you said, this right-wing dictator, sort of a democratically elected dictatorship of the ruling class, Colombia's natural resources have always been at the service of transnational companies, at the service of the U.S. So actually, it's the fifth largest producer of coal in the world, and this coal is all produced by a U.S. company, Drummond, which some people may have heard of, and a subsidiary of the Swiss company, Glencore. So Important to note, neither of these are state companies. So, first of all of the coal that's being produced in Colombia, which, by the way, is produced in one of the most impoverished regions of Colombia, which is, this coal extraction has completely devastated the region. So that's all there on the area of kind of this environmental level. The fact that actually these coal companies and the fact that that Colombia is such a big coal producer is already indicative of Colombia's position kind of in the global capitalist economy of always being subordinated to the United States and to the global north as sort of the raw materials supplier. Colombia is one of the most wealthy countries in natural resources, but has been so impoverished because of this right-wing rule. So, of course, banning coal exports to Israel is not necessarily saying we're going to nationalize the coal companies, which, of course, would probably be a little too severe for the moment for Gustavo Petro's government and where it finds itself. But it is a very strong signal not only to the US government, not only to Israel, but also to these transnational corporations of reasserting Colombia's sovereignty and saying, we do not agree with your foreign policy, the foreign policy of the United States that gives unconditional support to Israel, which is complicit in genocide, which is furthering genocide. And we, even though we're still sort of under this control of these transnational companies, we're actually going to assert our sovereignty and say, Colombian coal is not going to fuel the genocide. So I think this is such a strong move, and really, again, is part of Gustavo Petro's policy of trying to actually, make policy decisions in favor of the Colombian people. Of course, Gustavo Petro, just as a side note, has been really pushing like transition away from coal, from oil, which have been Colombia's traditional sources of revenue, and trying to expand into green energy, trying to boost up agricultural production in the country. So this is interesting because it also kind of falls in line with the general push away from this extractive economy that's, of course, devastating the environment in Colombia, and this push towards a more holistic economy and in line with human rights, not just in Colombia, but of course where these are being shipped to, and not being complicit in more human rights violations. And we know that Gustavo Petro drew so many comparisons between how the Colombian people have suffered under, of course, the U.S.-backed war on drugs that took place in Colombia, this U.S.-backed war against the left-wing guerrilla groups in the country. He's drawn so many comparisons to these two. So I think it's both a very political and economic position, but of course, one that he holds very close to his heart.
Well, another president in Latin America who's made some tough statements, and similar to Gustavo Petro with, comparison of the genocide happening in Gaza now to the Nazis, is President Lula Ignacio da Silva of Brazil. So some tough statements there. I think there's been some diplomatic moves. What's been happening on that front regarding Latin America-Israel relations, the Brazil front, that is?
Yeah, well, we've seen kind of a tremendous evolution of Lula's position with regards to Israel. His first statement, not really where most people wanted it to be. But since then, he's really, really moved his position to support the Palestinian people, condemn Israel. This, I just want to point out, is sort of in line with Lula and his political background, how he's acted, in other situations, in terms of really being on the side of humanity in this broad sense. He has even tried to kind of play a leadership role in terms of mediation, which we know he also tried to do with the war in Ukraine. He's someone who wants to solve the problems and make things better. And so he's really, tried to use all of those diplomatic tools. He went and greeted the Brazilian sort of people who were trapped in Gaza. There were some Palestinian Brazilian families who were evacuated when the border with Rafah was closed, and there had to be this very intense negotiation. And again, recently Lula, I think he recalled the ambassador. There has been a huge push for the past 8 months for Lula actually take a step further and suspend diplomatic relations. So important to point out is that Gustavo Petro this week, said they were going to suspend coal exports. And just a month prior, so at the beginning of May, is when he said that diplomatic relations would be completely broken. And so I think it maybe was 1 month into the genocide, Petro said that he was recalling his ambassador. This is not suspending ties. This is just saying that we're not going to have someone stationed there. It's sort of like a step in that direction. Brazil has now done that. It's issued these strong statements, but it hasn't taken the step which countries like Bolivia and now Colombia has done, which Turkey again has done, and other countries, of saying we are completely suspending diplomatic ties. And, different Brazilian analysts have pointed out that this isn't so surprising because the tradition of Brazilian foreign policy is one of kind of a conciliatory approach of like maintaining ties, of having this sort of neutral position, so to speak, of reciprocity. And so actually for Brazil and for Lula to take that step to suspend the diplomatic ties would be actually extremely strong. It would actually send a very strong message because of how it acts on the international scene, because of the mediator role, of course, Lula has played historically, because of the position Brazil does play. But it hasn't taken that step. And important to point out, Brazil is, of course, the largest economy in Latin America and the Caribbean, and it exports over $1 billion worth of crude oil to Israel. And so when we're talking about Colombia suspending coal shipments, we have to remember that Israel is not energy sovereign. It is one of the things that it tries to greenwash to the world is that it's innovating green technology and green energy. This is largely because the country, itself does not have energy reserves. It does not have oil, despite its neighbors all having that. They did discover some gas, but again, it's not enough to actually sustain the country. So they've tried to kind of create these other sources of energy, but it's still, of course, dependent on fossil fuels. So Colombia, being one of the largest suppliers of coal to Israel, is a huge hit. That's definitely one of its backups. It only, I think, accounts for 1/5 of its energy consumption at the moment. But again, if all of your other energy sources go wrong, I mean, fossil fuels are the reliable backup. And so actually Brazil's $1 billion worth of crude petroleum that's exported to Israel would have a huge impact. And so that's driving a lot of this demand between suspending diplomatic ties and actually taking this step to have this economic impact on Israel and make it unable for it to be able to continue with the status quo.
Zoe, I know Latin America is very large. However, and you can't, say one thing, how some people feel in Brazil is the same how they feel in Colombia or Argentina, for example. But I'm curious, I am going to ask you to generalize for a moment. What's the general vibe when it comes to Israel across Latin America? And you could even split it up by certain countries if you'd like to. But obviously, all around the world, Israel's turning into this pariah state, especially when it comes to how people on the ground feel. And so I imagine in Latin America, that's very much the case, because in the global South, generally speaking, with a few exceptions here and there, people tend to sympathize more with Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have the major outlier of just the one Milei who bizarrely converted to Judaism and is now like Israel's biggest fan. But he has a lot of other weird things going for him, and he's completely against his own people. So I don't think he really counts in this calculation. But, generally, I think it's a sentiment of disgust, of complete rejection, because what people are seeing on the news, either way, is that, 40,000 people have been massacred, that over 10,000 children have been killed. I think the broad sentiment is one of solidarity with the Palestinian cause. Of course, Latin America and the Caribbean is a continent that has a history of struggle, a history that's been resisting U.S. imperialism, of resisting the attempt of colonizing powers to control its economy, to control its culture, to control its political life. It would not be wrong to say that I think the majority of people, of course, identify with this sentiment of wanting sovereignty, wanting freedom. Of course, the case of Palestine is one of, atrocious, violent, horrific genocide and settler colonialism. And I think that moves people. They haven't been as indoctrinated as, for example, the United States, which has a huge, of course, historic campaign to win over people to the cause of Zionism. That hasn't existed as much in Latin America in the past, perhaps decade and a half, when Israel kind of shifted its focus to Latin America as a potential source of political, diplomatic support and an economic market in terms of imports, exports, which we can see with the signing of several free trade agreements, like the one I mentioned with Colombia in 2014. In the ends of the 2000s, Mercosur also signed a free trade agreement with Israel, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Mexico, and Panama. So there was sort of this shift, but the cultural kind of allegiance to Zionism does not exist. And so all people are seeing is that there's one occupying power massacring a people who are doing absolutely nothing. And that, of course, moves people. Mobilizations have gotten bigger. They have gotten with this demand to cut ties. So I think that we are seeing, as you're saying, across the global south, this broad sentiment of rejection to Israel that maybe they didn't have before because it wasn't as present and it wasn't, going across their TV screen. But now that they're seeing it, they're definitely questioning and rejecting what Israel's doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the best places to follow all of these details and more, of course, is peoplesdispatch.org, peoplesdispatch.org, the outlet of which you are the co-editor. Zoe Alexandra, as always, we appreciate you helping us sort through all of these various things and giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me.